Hey guys, we're in a late model JK with a V6, a 3.6 turbocharged engine. I drive all sorts of Jeeps. In fact, last week I drove a 6.4 Hemi, I drove a couple of supercharged Jeeps, and now we're in a turbocharged V6. Now I gotta say, this is one of the better running turbocharged Jeeps that I've driven. It exhibits the typical turbocharged characteristics like the soft bottom end, and I know a lot of turbocharged guys will say, oh, there's no lag, but there is. You basically get a soft bottom end and then it comes on harder at the top. We got a check engine light on, which is pretty typical, trying to keep the O2 and catalytic converter codes out of these things. But aside from that, this thing actually runs pretty good. You'll notice that we're near zero on our intake manifold vacuum, and I'm modulating the throttle. What that basically means is we're in that twilight zone of between boost and normally aspirated. Now, this customer so graciously has supplied a air-fuel ratio gauge, and that is going to be a wideband and a intake manifold vacuum gauge, which are both very important when you have a turbocharged or forced induction motor. Supercharging is basically any kind of forced induction, including supercharging and turbocharging. So with a wideband O2, I should probably say something about that. And before I talk about that, let's talk about a narrowband O2 sensor, because that's the most widely used sensor. A long time ago, some really smart guys in labs figured out what the most appropriate air-fuel ratio was for these gas engines. And that turned out to be about 14.7 to 1, which is stoichiometric, or stoic. And there's a whole science of stoichiometry, which we're not going to get into, but basically know that if you're running about 14.7 to 1 air-fuel ratio on pure gasoline, that is considered the best combination of performance, emissions, economy, etc. Now, can you get better economy by leaning it out? Sure. Can you get better performance by riching it out? Sure. But they had to come up with a number that worked for everyday vehicles that most of us drive. So they settled on about 14.7 to 1. And by the way, we're getting on the freeway right now, and I'm really pushing the throttle. I'm probably 3/4 open. You can see we're running about 2 pounds of boost. Now, if I get into it, you're going to see that go up. Now, we're also running in closed loop. You can tell because we're running at about 14.7 to 1. But what I'm experiencing is that soft pedal, that rubber band feel where you push, and then it just, there'll be a burst of power, and we'll go into that later. So getting back to the Narrowband O2 sensor, they determined 14.7 to 1 was stoichiometric. That's what we wanted to aim for. Believe it or not, way back in 1976, I worked on my first closed-loop feedback Lambda system. It was a Bosch system. Fuel injection had been around a long time. Even the German fighter planes from World War II were fuel injected, but they were programmed fuel injection, or programmable fuel injection, where they were just set to a certain value and they just shoot fuel into it. What they wanted was some kind of a feedback, kind of like a servo versus a stepper motor, so that they knew what the air-fuel ratio was, and then they can control it. So they added what was called an oxygen sensor. And the early oxygen sensors were really primitive. Early oxygen sensors were grounded off the chassis. They weren't grounded off a low reference, which is ground supplied by an ECM. So they were pretty crude. They didn't work at low RPM or even at idle. They would go into open loop because there wasn't enough heat there. They weren't heated. They didn't have heaters in them. But that's kind of another discussion. So what the closed-loop feedback oxygen sensor system did was it allowed feedback of air-fuel ratio to some kind of a computer that could then control it. Way back in 1976, I worked on a Cadillac Seville. It was one of the first American, and by the way, we got a radar detector in this, Smokey and the Bandit. Remember Buford T. Justice? So the system was primitive, but it worked. It basically tried to target stoic using a narrowband O2 sensor. A narrowband O2 sensor is only really accurate at one point, and that is stoichiometric, which is about, and we're going to try to go around this truck here. Now, I didn't feel comfortable because I got into the throttle. It really didn't go. Now I'm into the throttle. You can see we're pushing about 5 pounds of boost. Took about 2 or 3 seconds, but then we got that burst of power. And that really is the biggest difference between a normally aspirated large engine and a turbocharged or forced induction small engine. You're just not going to get the same linear power delivery. And it's not so much true with a supercharger as a turbocharger, because a supercharger is mechanically driven, where a turbocharger is driven off exhaust gas. So going up this grade, I'm really into the throttle. I'm probably 50-60%, and you can see that we're hovering around 0, maybe a little bit of boost to go up this hill. So we're in that twilight zone where the pedal is basically non-effective. You can move it 20-30% one way or the other, and it just doesn't do a whole lot. And that's not like a V8. A V8 is going to be completely linear. The more you push that pedal, the more it's going to go. All right, so getting back to the closed-loop feedback system, in order to make the system cost-effective, they made an O2 sensor that essentially can only accurately read one value, and that's stoichiometric. So they made that okay, so now I was almost floored there, and I wasn't really accelerating. Then I got a burst of power. So a narrowband O2 sensor is really a voltage generator. It's not powered. It uses the heat of the exhaust to measure the content of the oxygen in the exhaust stream. Now, they know that at stoichiometric, the content of the exhaust should be about 1.5%. 21% oxygen is what's in the free air. That's about what you're breathing right now. About 79% is nitrogen, and then there's some trace gases also. So they know if they have complete combustion, it's going to be about 1.5% oxygen in the exhaust system. So they designed the narrowband O2 sensor to sense 1.5% oxygen, and that's about 0.450 millivolts, or almost half a volt. And the oxygen sensor actually generates this voltage and puts it out to the computer. So the computer can look at that voltage and say, I'm at 0.6 or 600 millivolts. I'm running rich. So then it pulls the fuel back, fuel injected. Now, they did have in the 80s carbureted feedback systems. I don't know if you guys remember the old Rochester carburetors, but they go click, 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 click. They had solenoids in them, and they actually tried to modulate the carburetors, and it was really a mistake in my opinion, because they were mechanically operated and just weren't very reliable. Now, fuel injectors are mechanically operated, but the technology of fuel injectors went way beyond carburetors, and we're injecting the fuel behind the intake valve. We're not injecting it into the intake manifold. So basically, if the oxygen sensor said, hey, you're rich, it would put a lean command in, and then it would pull the fuel out. The voltage would drop to, let's say, 0.2 of a volt. Then the computer would say, hey, now I'm lean, and it would put a rich command out, and it would fatten it up, and it would go above 0.450. So that's where you get that oxygen sensor switching up and down, up and down. But really, the only place that it's accurate is at 0.45 volts, or stoichiometric. Now, if you start introducing other fuels, like you put alcohol in your fuel, the beauty of the closed-loop feedback narrowband system is the stoichiometry of different fuels still have about a 1.5% oxygen sensor value. So if you put some alcohol in your fuel, you could be running at 14.2 to 1, because remember, pure alcohol is more like 9 to 1, and most of us are running fuel with alcohol in it. And because we're looking at the oxygen content, not the hydrocarbon or the fuel content, the operating system will adjust around that. Now, systems that are not designed for, let's say, E85, where you're running the majority of alcohol, cannot cope with that high level of alcohol. But a little bit of alcohol, they don't really usually have a problem with. There's virtual sensors, which use the O2 sensors to sense stoichiometry, and then there's hard sensors. And the LTs have gone back to a hard sensor. I'm not really sure why. Maybe they're more accurate, but hard sensors are more costly, but also more accurate. So in a production vehicle where we're trying to run closed loop and get the best economy and performance and all that, narrowband O2 sensors work great. But what about in an environment where you want to get better economy and you want to go open loop and you want to run leaner, like the lean burn systems of the 80s and 90s, where we were running 17, 18 to 1 air-fuel ratios? Or a race situation where you want to run 11 to 12 to 1 to get maximum power. Right around 12 to 1 is where you're going to get maximum power. But of course, your economy and emissions aren't going to be ideal. Now, you're going to see this gauge, especially on deceleration, jump above 14 to 1, even go 17, 18, 20 to 1, because it's going to go into what we call deceleration fuel cutoff, as we discussed before. And at some point, it's just going to go to all zeros, because there's going to be no fuel going into it and there's nothing to measure. So in those situations, when you go open loop, you want to be able to accurately measure the air-fuel ratio. And that's where you go to a wideband O2 sensor. Now, a wideband O2 sensor is powered. A wideband O2 sensor usually has 3 wires instead of the standard 2. And the older O2 sensors only had 1 wire. Like I said, they use engine ground to ground the O2. today we have low reference, and we'll talk about that in another video, because low reference is the way the computer can more accurately read the sensor data by providing its own ground. Remember, these oxygen sensors are running in millivolts. That's thousandths of a volt, so they have to be very accurate. So with a wideband O2 sensor, we can read air-fuel ratios of 9 to 1, 10 to 1, 12 to 1, and if you're on the track, that's invaluable. You don't want to blow the engine up by running it too lean. So you can dial in the fuel injectors and your fuel tables and all that using a wideband O2 sensor. In fact, most dynos have a wideband O2 sensor, so they can do exactly that. On the flip side of that, if you want to get better economy, there used to be something called lean burn. And you remember the old Hondas and Toyotas that were lean burn vehicles back in the 80s and 90s, and they were getting incredible mileage, 40 plus miles to the gallon, probably better than a lot of today's hybrids. And they were doing that by switching out of closed loop and going into open loop and then leaning the mixture out. The problem with lean burn was we were increasing the levels of NOx, or nitrides of oxygen. That's where a nitrogen and an oxygen atom melt together. They're melted together at high temperatures and high pressures, usually over 2,500 degrees inside of a combustion chamber. So remember, stoichiometry says that the minimum amount of emissions is at about 14.7 to 1. So by going to 18 to 1, we were increasing the NOx emissions greatly. So in North America, they banned lean burn a long time ago. So there's advantages to running an open loop. Now, sometimes we have to run an open loop. When you first start your vehicle, we have to have a richer mixture to warm that engine up. We have to get those cats to light off. So you're going to be in open loop, you're going to be in a cold start mode, and you're probably going to be running 12, 13 to 1. When you let your foot off the gas and decelerate, those injectors are going to start to cut back, and you can go into DCFO as we talked about. In fact, I'll probably be doing that now. Now, right now I'm going up to slight grade, and I'm giving it more throttle, more throttle, more throttle. Now you can see I'm at 0, 0, 0, transmission downshifted. Now we went into a slight amount of boost. Now the difference between this engine and a V8 is I gave it throttle, I gave it throttle, I gave it throttle. I didn't really notice any change, and then the boost came in and it kind of took off. With an LS, you would have accelerated, or a Hemi, you would have accelerated. Okay, so we are right now at about 2 pounds negative of intake, and we are in stoichiometric. Now I'm going to let the gas off and watch what happens to our air-fuel ratio. Now, at first you saw it go a little bit fat because it had to shut the injectors off, then it shut the injectors off. You saw it shoot up to about 25 to 1, and then it went blank, meaning the injectors were shut off. So this is a wideband O2 sensor, and that's the value of it. Is it's not only accurate at one value, it's accurate across the whole air-fuel ratio band. And that's probably something you want to have with a non-normally aspirated engine, because if you have a turbocharger and it goes into boost and you run lean, you could have problems. Now, I will say that you got a couple of gauges here that's all they do is measure these two values. You could have a gauge like an Aeroforce gauge and port in these values and have hundreds and hundreds of generic and enhanced PIDs, oil temperature, oil pressure, transmission temperature, current gear, all that in the same gauge, and still have the fuel pressure, air-fuel ratio, intake manifold vacuum, and all that on one gauge. So as I go up and down these mountains now, you guys know I drive this road all the time. It's kind of an undulating hill. And what I noticed is I have wide throttle pedal position to do what I want to do. So I have to give it a lot of throttle to go just a little bit. And then I can feel the boost come in and it kind of takes off and I got to let off. So when we talk about power adders that are not normally aspirated, and with a normally aspirated engine, of course, you guys know you can put camshafts in and intakes and increase the flow and increase the volumetric efficiency of your engine and still keep that honest drivability. But when we talk about outside the box, turbochargers, superchargers, forced induction, nitrous oxide, we really got to be careful because we don't want to lose drivability. And as far as I'm concerned, there is no V6 out there with any kind of power adder that can rival the drivability of any V8. And that doesn't matter what V8. It could be a Ford, it could be a Chevy. The honest linear power delivery of a low-stress V8 is nothing like the sound and the delivery of power of a V6. So I used to work with Christopher Jacobs back in the 1980s. Some of you guys might know him. You can go read the Doctor's Guide, but we were really on the pinnacle of computerizing power adders. One of the things that we did was called the Nitrous Safety Kit. We also worked in NASCAR with soft rev limiters. A lot of the technology you see today, Dr. Jacobs developed. But out in the streets of Eagle Rock in the valley, we saw guys blowing their engines up. The Sneaky Pete's, the guys putting nitrous on their vehicles for racing. There was really no control. And if you put oxygen, basically liquid oxygen, into your combustion chamber, it's going to burn whatever is available. First it's going to burn the fuel, then it's going to burn a valve or a piston or whatever else is left. So what we had to do is try to figure out how can we stop that. At the same time, engine knock. Remember, back in the days we didn't have knock sensors like we do today. If your engine starts to knock at low RPM and you put a bunch of laughing gas into it, you're going to break a rod or something. And it happened all the time. So our nitrous safety kit actually fitted a knock sensor. We used a similar system to the old Buick Grand National. I don't know if you guys remember that, but that was one of the first engines to run it. And it would retard the spark timing if engine knock was detected. At the same time, we ran a Hobb switch on the fuel system. So if the fuel pressure would drop off, it would cut the nitrous off. And that really was a big problem because a lot of guys were running nitrous with street gas, and the fuel pumps of the day just weren't up to the delivery. So maybe you guys remember the old blue pumps and red pumps that Holley made and others. There were electric booster pumps, so when the nitrous would come in, it would kick into one of these. And by the way, just driving up this little hill here, this turbo's really annoying me. It's upshifting, it's downshifting, and you can see we're at that magic 0 where the throttle is effectively not effective. Here, watch. I'm gonna work this throttle about 20%. Now I'm working the throttle, transmission's upshifting and downshifting, but I'm not really accelerating or decelerating. I'm just staying here. With a V8, like I said, I'd take off like a raped ape. But back in 1981, Christopher Jacobs and I built a 1981 Camaro. We put a blueprint roller cam engine in it, which costs more than a LT1 today, and we were able to run consistently enough to run in the 11-second bracket with these full-blown trailered race cars in a street-driven 81 Camaro. Go read the Doctor's Guide to Engine Performance. Very interesting book. Christopher Jacobs was like Doc Brown, and the 81 Camaro was like the DeLorean. It had computers everywhere. We were controlling the timing, we were controlling the fuel mixture. Even though it was a carburetor, we actually had a variable orifice jet, and we were getting 20 miles to the gallon back then, and we were still running 11s in a street-driven car. It was pretty amazing, but it took the Wizard of Oz to run the thing with all the computers and such inside of it. Today's operating systems do all that, and you don't even have to think about it. We're driving a very well-built turbocharged JK. This Jeep is tight. I gave the customer a thumbs up. He did a good job on the build. I think he went as far as he can go with the turbocharger, and he's getting about the most out of it. It's got good power. The drivability is acceptable. Now, when he gets into a V8 and drives it, he's going to have a whole different look on what drivability is. Now, as far as the horsepower goes, this Jeep's going to get an LS, so the horsepower probably isn't going to be very much more than he's got right now. But what is going to be a lot better is the reliability, the drivability, the linear power response, the longevity of the engine, and I could go on and on. You get a low-stressed, large displacement V8 putting the same power out that he's putting out now. When I'm on these hilly roads, and I believe this guy does live in Texas, and I call Texas hill country because you basically have rolling hills, and what that does for an operating system, it makes it accelerate and decelerate a lot differently than if you're just on flat ground. And that's really where you notice these anomalies in these supercharged and turbocharged engines, is going in and out of boost.